So usually when you look at an architectural blueprint, um, there's this expectation of absolute precision, right?
Right, yeah. You're looking for exact measurements.
Exactly. You see the load-bearing walls, the electrical grid, the plumbing layout. A contractor can point at it and tell you exactly how the building is going to stand against the wind or, how it handles gravity.
But it's a concrete, functional plan.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's math and engineering. But then you step into the world of ancient religious texts, and suddenly that exact same type of structural blueprint is treated like, well, like a magical painting.
Oh, absolutely. It becomes purely aesthetic.
Right. We're looking at a document that, according to the sources we are poring over today, is fundamentally designed to build a functioning, equitable civilization. But instead of actually executing the engineering, humanity has kind of just hung the blueprint on a wall, draped it in velvet, and decided to just chant at it.
Yeah, the tragedy of that approach is what we can call the ritual trap.
The ritual trap. I like that phrasing.
It's when a society loses the capacity to understand the actual engineering of a text, so they default to venerating the ink and the paper instead.
Right. Because that's easier, honestly.
It is.
Yeah.
And we see this across various traditions. But the specific breakdown we are analyzing today, which is Allama G.A. Parwez's rationalist analysis of Surah Al-Imran from the Quran, it argues that Orthodox theology has essentially trapped humanity in a cycle of passive rituals.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, so the text itself is entirely stripped of its socioeconomic demands. It gets reduced to a religious placeholder.
Wow.
What's fascinating here is the fundamental paradigm shift Parwez introduces. We are moving away from chanting words in the hopes of magically altering destiny and moving toward an intense, intellectual inner transformation that drives actual systemic action in the real world.
Right, because Parwez's thesis completely shatters the baseline assumptions a lot of people have about religion as a whole. And for you listening, this is the core mission of our analysis today. We really want to figure out, why do people universally recite these specific verses from Surah Al-Imran merely to seek mystical blessings, while the absolute socioeconomic justice those exact verses explicitly demand is just entirely ignored?
It's a massive contradiction.
It really is. How did a civilizational blueprint devolve into a book of spells?
Well, the mechanism behind that devolution is deeply linguistic. I mean, if your definitions of the fundamental vocabulary are corrupted, the entire blueprint becomes unreadable.
That makes total sense. If you think the word for brick actually means cloud, you're not going to build a very good house.
That is a perfect analogy. Parwez argues that over centuries, the terminology of the Quran was deliberately injected with foreign, purely mystical concepts.
So the original meaning was just buried.
Completely. So, to understand how a religious text functions as a civilizational blueprint, you have to aggressively strip away centuries of cultural baggage from its vocabulary. You must redefine the linguistic key.
Okay, so let's start with one of the most universally recognized concepts in religion, dua, which is almost always translated simply as prayer.
Right, the standard definition.
Yeah. And the common conception of prayer is an emotional entreaty. You're in a tough spot, maybe a financial crisis or a health scare, so you beg God to miraculously suspend the laws of physics or nature to grant a wish.
That's the orthodox view, yes.
But Parwez uses a highly distressing, really vivid analogy to deconstruct this passive view. He describes a mother, a widow, sitting by the bed of her dying son.
It's a very heavy example.
It is. He's her only support in the world, and she is praying with absolute, unquestionable sincerity. Her emotional devotion is at its absolute peak.
Right.
But the source argues that despite her intense sincerity, if the physical, natural laws of medicine aren't applied, the child passes away.
Which is the harsh reality of the physical universe.
Yeah, but I have to push back here for a second. For a lot of people, saying her prayer failed because she didn't use medicine feels, well, incredibly harsh.
It does. It confronts a lot of deeply held comforts.
Right. It almost feels like a complete rejection of the spiritual comfort of prayer itself.
Well, Parwez is not denying the psychological reality of her grief, but he is forcing us to confront the unyielding reality of the physical universe.
Okay, so it's about not ignoring the physical laws.
Exactly. The rationalist critique points out that the orthodox view of dua as begging for a miracle is fundamentally flawed because it assumes the universe operates on arbitrary favoritism rather than permanent laws. According to the original Arabic root, dua does not mean begging. Literally, it means to call out.
Just to call out.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is the act of calling out for guidance when you are standing at the crossroads of life. You aren't asking the creator to do the work for you or to break the laws of biology.
You're asking for the roadmap.
Precisely. You are asking to be shown the correct path so you can do the work yourself.
So if I'm lost in a dense forest, traditional prayer is me sitting on a stump, closing my eyes, and asking to be teleported to my living room.
Which obviously isn't going to happen.
Right, but Parwez is saying dua is actually asking for a compass and a topographical map, and this is the key part, accepting that I still have to hike 20 miles through the mud.
That is exactly it.
Yeah.
And the linguistic history of the word supports that exact distinction.
Yeah, there was a specific detail from the text that really caught my attention here.
The etymology.
Yes, the root concept of dua in ancient Arabia is actually related to the physical act of stimulating an animal's udder to release milk.
It's such an earthy, mechanical metaphor.
It really is, for something we usually treat as purely ethereal and, mystical.
But the mechanics of the metaphor are what make it brilliant.
Yeah.
Think about the physical reality of milking an animal. The milk is already there, right?
Yeah, it's inside the animal.
Exactly. The sustenance exists as a latent potential within the natural system, but it requires a specific, active, kinetic stimulus from the human being to draw it out.
The animal doesn't just magically drop a bucket of milk at your feet because you wished for it.
Exactly. In the human psychological context, Parwez argues that dua is the awakening of an intense, constructive inner desire.
The source uses an Urdu term for this, right? Arzu.
Yes, arzu. It's this driving ambition. It is the psychological catalyst that converts stagnant human potential into active kinetic energy.
This complete reframing makes the traditional view look almost absurd.
It really highlights the passivity of the traditional view.
Yeah, because our source uses another analogy. It's like a profoundly thirsty man standing on the bank of a roaring river.
Right, the water is right there.
Exactly. The system of sustenance is flowing literally right in front of him, but instead of physically cupping his hands, bending down and drinking, he just stretches his arms out to the sky and chants, "Quench my thirst, quench my thirst."
Expecting the water to defy gravity.
Yeah, to just jump
Okay.
up into his mouth. And the tragic part is, when he eventually dies of thirst, the Orthodox mindset assumes he just didn't chant hard enough.
Or maybe use the wrong mystical syllable.
Right, or they'll just say, well, it was just his destiny to die thirsty.
And the danger of that Orthodox mindset is how deeply it pacifies a society.
That's the real-world consequence right there.
It is. When you frame political and socioeconomic problems through the lens of that thirsty man, you realize exactly how entire populations are kept subjugated.
Because they aren't taking action.
Exactly. They stand by the river of national resources, completely impoverished, and they just chant for a miracle, waiting for the heavens to drop wealth into their laps.
Wow. That is a terrifyingly effective way to control people.
It's systemic paralysis.
Mm-hmm.
But if dua is actually the strategic planning of an awakened mind, the first step of realizing you have a goal and actively seeking the systemic roadmap to achieve it, then we have to deeply analyze what God's answer actually looks like in this framework.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that is the exact pivot point of the argument.
Right.
If prayer is asking for the roadmap, what does the answer or ijaba actually consist of?
Because usually people think the answer is the miracle itself.
Exactly. The cancer goes into spontaneous remission, or a mysterious benefactor suddenly pays off your mortgage. But the text's breakdown of Surah Al-Imran, specifically verse 195, provides a jarring alternative.
It's a complete shift in expectation.
Yeah. The verse is presented as God's codified answer to humanity's call. And the answer isn't a suspension of physics, it's a permanent constitutional guarantee.
A guarantee.
Yes. The verse explicitly states, I do not waste the labor of any worker.
The magnitude of that single sentence cannot be overstated within this rationalist framework.
It's massive.
God's answer is not arbitrary. It is a universal, constitutional guarantee of cause and effect. The divine response to human struggle is the guarantee that the physical universe is designed to reward constructive effort.
So it's built into the physics of the universe.
Yes. If humanity aligns its inner desire, its dua, with the divine parameters of justice, and then steps out into the physical world to perform actual strenuous labor, the system guarantees that their effort will yield results.
So God answers humanity through the inviolability of his revealed permanent laws.
Exactly. It's a dependable system.
It's basically a contract. But the source material makes a really aggressive point here about the sequence of this contract.
About who answers who first.
Yes. God demands that humanity must first answer his call by having absolute conviction in these socioeconomic principles before they can expect any systemic result in the real world.
You have to sign the contract and execute the labor before the contract pays out.
Exactly. And that totally redefines the concept of faith, or iman.
It does, because the traditional framing of faith relies heavily on fragility. It is pitched as blind faith.
Oh, yeah. The sort of belief system where if a skeptic asks a really sharp logical question, the religious authority figures scramble.
And they say, oh, don't ask that, you'll lose your faith, just believe in your heart.
Right, right. Just close your eyes and trust us.
But the rationalist school violently rejects this premise.
I found the source material almost mocking of that kind of fragile belief.
It doesn't pull any punches.
No, it basically argues that if your faith is like a house of cards that collapses the moment a gust of intellectual wind hits it, you didn't have faith at all. You had a delusion.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, if a building inspector taps a load-bearing wall and the whole house crumbles, you don't execute the inspector for asking questions. You fire the architect for building a terrible house.
Exactly. And the redefinition of Iman is critical here.
Hmm.
For Parwez, Iman is not blind emotion.
So what is it?
It is absolute conviction based on intellect, objective evidence, and profound philosophical reasoning.
So it's rational certainty.
Yes, rational certainty in the inherent justice and stability of the divine order. It is the difference between believing a bridge will hold your weight, because you just sort of feel it will, versus stepping onto the bridge with absolute confidence because you understand the physics.
You know the material tensile strength and the math of the engineering.
Exactly. You've done the math.
Okay, so if dua is the strategic planning of an awakened mind, and iman is this indestructible rational conviction in the system's engineering, I have a massive structural question.
Okay, well, let's hear it.
Why is the world so caught up in the ritual of begging?
That is the big question.
I mean, if this constitutional system is so beautifully rational, why do so many people still rely on intermediaries? I'm talking about saints, shrines, spiritual gatekeepers, the whole industry of intercession.
It's a huge industry.
It is. Why do people prefer begging at a tomb over executing a constitutional labor contract?
Well, to understand that massive cognitive dissonance, we have to look at the historical corruption of the divine system.
So this was done on purpose.
Yes. Parwez identifies a sociological disease called mulukiyat, which translates roughly to monarchical despotism.
Monarchical despotism.
The text explains that the passive paradigm of prayer didn't organically evolve out of nowhere. It was a deliberate, weaponized corruption driven by the historical rise of monarchy and feudalism.
Wait, explain the mechanism there. How does a king taking over a country change the definition of an ancient Arabic word?
It's about maintaining power. When human kings, emperors, and despots seized control of early societies, they faced a crisis of legitimacy.
Because the original text doesn't support kings.
Exactly. A rational system where every human has direct, equal access to a constitutional guarantee of their labor is highly dangerous to a king.
Oh, because a king thrives on arbitrary power.
Arbitrary power, favoritism, and hoarding surplus wealth. To legitimize their absolute, inaccessible rule on earth, the ruling classes projected the image of an earthly king onto the concept of God.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. It's like a corrupt corporate bureaucracy.
So,
Well, if you're an entry-level worker, the system convinces you that the CEO, in this case, God, is sitting on some distant, inaccessible throne on the top floor of a skyscraper.
right, you can't just walk in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You were told you were too dirty, too sinful, or too lowly to just email the CEO directly. So what do?
You have to go to the middle managers.
Yes. You have to find the executive assistants, the courtiers, the people who, quote-unquote, have the CEO's ear. You have to bribe the gatekeepers to bypass the standard rules and get your application approved.
That is exactly what happened. The source material uses the Urdu term sifaresh for this.
Sifarish.
Yes, which means intercession, or using your connections to get an unfair advantage. The mapping of political corruption onto theology is complete at that point.
That is incredibly manipulative.
It is. Historically, monarchs surrounded themselves with an impenetrable layer of courtiers. If a peasant wanted a favor or a grievance addressed, they didn't rely on the law because the law was rigged.
Right, they begged a courtier instead.
Exactly. And suddenly, theology mirrored this entirely. God was no longer accessible through a transparent constitution of cause and effect.
Yeah.
God became a tyrant on a throne.
And to get his attention, you needed spiritual courtiers.
Saints, peers, deceased mystics buried in grand shrines, you had to go through their bureaucratic network to get your prayer heard.
And the source material points out how profoundly this degrades human dignity.
It really does.
This isn't just a theological disagreement about how to pray. It is the systemic stripping of human agency.
Yes, you're removed from the equation.
Instead of being an active, dignified participant in a constitutional social contract, you are reduced to a groveling beggar.
And the Quran, according to this rationalist view, explicitly and violently condemns this practice.
Yeah, praying at shrines, begging the dead, relying on any kind of intermediary. The text categorizes these as prayers of disbelief.
Prayers of disbelief.
Right, and it calls them that because they fundamentally deny the direct systemic guarantee God has already established.
Because by begging an intermediary, an individual is essentially issuing a vote of no confidence in the divine order.
Wow, that's a powerful way to frame it.
You are basically saying, I do not believe the constitutional guarantee that my labor will not be wasted is sufficient. I need a back channel. I need a bribe.
You're calling the system broken.
Exactly. And this is where Parwez elevates the discussion from theology to statecraft. The eradication of these intermediaries isn't just a polite suggestion.
No, the state, the physical functioning society, must actively abolish these intermediary exploitation networks.
Wait, let me make sure I am grasping the scale of this.
Yeah.
Are you saying the text mandates the physical dismantling of these spiritual bureaucracies as an actionable item for the government?
Yes, precisely the opposite of a passive suggestion. It is a civil rights mandate.
A civil rights mandate.
Yeah. A just society must dismantle the political, spiritual, and bureaucratic networks that function as gatekeepers. Parwez argues that citizens must never be placed in a position of humiliation where they are forced to beg an intermediary.
Right, whether that's a corrupt government clerk demanding a bribe for a permit or a spiritual figure at a shrine demanding an offering for a blessing.
Exactly. You shouldn't have to beg just to secure your fundamental human rights or your economic needs.
That is a staggering paradigm shift. It takes the mystical and makes it entirely political and socioeconomic.
It essentially says that a citizen's humiliation at the hands of a corrupt bureaucracy is a spiritual failure of the state itself.
But this raises a massive practical question.
Okay, what is it?
If we tear down these spiritual gatekeepers and eliminate the middle managers, we are left with a massive societal void. I mean, people go to shrines and beg bureaucrats because they genuinely need material help.
Yes, they need money, food, jobs.
Exactly. So if we understand that God answers us directly through the constitutional guarantee of I do not waste the labor of any worker, what does the actual implementation of this economy look like?
Right. How do we build what the text calls the Nizam-e-Rububiyat?
The system of providence, yes. How do we build that to replace the corrupt bureaucracy?
Well, building the system of providence requires us to look at another completely redefined term from the text, amal.
Amal, which usually translates to labor or action.
Right. Under the monarchical corruption we just discussed, amal was deliberately reduced to performing repetitive religious rituals.
Oh, of course.
The courtiers convinced the public that action meant praying a certain number of times, fasting, or chanting specific phrases.
Because it kept the populace busy and unthreatening.
Exactly. But systemically, within the rationalist blueprint, an emil, a worker, is an individual engaged in strenuous, constructive, socio-political, and economic labor.
So an emil isn't a monk sitting in a cave meditating for 20 years.
Not at all. An emil is an engineer building water infrastructure, a teacher educating the next generation, a worker creating tangible economic value, or an activist fighting systemic injustice.
The monk in the cave is entirely disconnected from the social contract.
Yes. Amal is the mandatory physical execution of that contract. But the text acknowledges a severe operational hazard here.
Okay, what's the hazard?
The expert analysis notes that individual effort, if pursued in absolute isolation within a corrupt, capitalist, or feudal society, will almost certainly be crushed.
Oh yeah. A single honest worker cannot outcompete a massive exploitative monopoly.
The opposing systemic forces are simply too strong for one person. Therefore, the individual cannot act alone. They must integrate their labor into the millat.
The millat, being the collective body, right? The organized caravan of society.
Right. But a caravan needs a leader, right? A collective body without a brain is just a mob.
Exactly. And the organized caravan must operate under a markaz, which translates to a central authority or state apparatus.
Okay, but wait. We just dismantled kings and despots. How is this markaz different from a king?
The role of the markaz is critical to differentiate. The markaz is not a dictator. Its operational role is to sit at that crossroads of dual we talked about at the beginning.
Ah, the strategic planning.
Yes. The state acts as the ultimate strategic planner. It consults the permanent values of the Quran, universal justice, absolute equity, guaranteed sustenance to formulate systemic goals.
And then it mobilizes the psychological and physical energies of the populace toward those targets.
So in this framework, dua isn't just an individual asking for a good day. It's the state itself strategically planning for a good century.
It's institutionalized policy planning based on universal values.
Exactly. But when we look at the workforce that this markaz is mobilizing, there is a specific phrase in Surah Al-Imran 3.195 that absolutely floored me when I read the analysis.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
It is so brief, yet it completely upends centuries of social hierarchy.
You are referring to the phrase min zakar a untha.
Yes, min zakar a untha. It translates to whether male or female, you are members one of another.
So what does this all mean in the context of building a massive economic engine?
Well, the inclusion of that specific phrase raises an incredibly important question about the vast chasm between historical religious interpretation and the actual structural text.
Because history hasn't been very kind to that idea of parity.
Not at all. Traditionalists, heavily influenced by patriarchal tribalism and feudalism, have consistently used biological determinism to justify massive hierarchical divisions of labor, social status, and economic compensation.
Right.
They argue that men and women have fundamentally different natures and therefore must occupy radically unequal socioeconomic roles.
With women almost always relegated to uncompensated domestic labor or just entirely excluded from economic agency.
It's the classic strategy of using biology as a convenient excuse for structural economic discrimination. They say, oh, it's just the natural order. Well, the men control all the capital.
But the Parwezian analysis points out that the Quranic framework violently deconstructs that patriarchal assumption.
It really does.
In the exact same verse that lays out the ultimate constitutional guarantee of labor, I do not waste the labor of any worker. The text explicitly appends the clarifying clause, from among you, whether male or female.
It structurally eradicates gender discrimination in the socioeconomic sphere.
It leaves zero biological loophole for exploitation.
None. The divine system, as outlined here, does not distinguish between genders regarding the necessity of struggle, the intrinsic value of labor, or the distribution of compensation.
And this is not a polite suggestion, right?
No, it is an explicit constitutional directive. The source notes that for the system of providence, the Nizam-e-Brubiyat, to actually function, the state, the markaz, must enact absolute gender parity in the workforce. The labor of women must be valued, compensated, and structurally protected exactly identically to that of men. Economic structures must maintain zero tolerance for biological discrimination.
I am continually amazed by this. We are talking about an ancient text, born in an incredibly patriarchal era, yet the functional application being drawn from it is a radically egalitarian economic structure.
It is literally demanding equal pay for equal work as a divine constitutional human right.
But speaking of compensation, how exactly does this system ensure that a worker isn't just paid equally, but paid fairly?
That's a crucial distinction.
Because you could have perfect gender parity in a sweatshop, and it's still horrific exploitation.
Yeah.
Equal misery isn't justice.
The mechanics of fair compensation bring us to the concept of thawab, and specifically the phrase husni thawab.
Okay, husni thawab.
And once again, we have to peel back the Orthodox translation to see the engineering underneath. Traditionally, thawab is perceived as abstract spiritual credits.
Like invisible points recorded in some divine ledger for the afterlife?
Exactly. As a reward for ritual piety. You chant a specific phrase 100 times, you get 100 thawab points.
It treats religion like a spiritual loyalty card. You punch enough holes by performing rituals, and eventually you get a free mansion in heaven.
Entirely disconnected from how you behaved economically on earth.
Right. And that abstraction is incredibly dangerous because it completely pacifies people in the present moment.
How so?
Well, if your reward is entirely abstract and deferred to the afterlife, you won't demand fair wages today, you won't unionize, you won't protest a corrupt landlord.
You'll just accept the suffering now for the payout later.
Exactly. But rationally, linguistically, Parwez explains that thawab literally means getting the precise, tangible economic return for one's actions or labor.
Tangible return.
Yes, and the modifier husn denotes perfect proportion, ultimate beauty, and absolute balance.
So husni thawab isn't a beautiful abstract blessing. It's a perfectly balanced, equitable economic return for physical labor.
It is the ultimate anti-exploitation law. The divine system guarantees that a worker receives the full equivalent of their labor, without a ruling class skimming the surplus value.
So the primary job of the state the mark has is to guarantee that the wealth generated by a worker is returned to them equitably.
Yes. This structurally eradicates both exploitative capitalism, where capital owners extract surplus labor, and feudalism, where landlords extract agricultural labor.
Because the goal of the blueprint is to maintain a perfectly balanced socioeconomic order in this world.
Right, which naturally, by the immutable law of cause and effect, extends its benefits into the next stage of human consciousness.
Okay, this is a massive realization. We're looking at a system that demands strategic planning instead of passive wishes.
Yep.
Collective labor under a central authority. Absolute gender parity in the workforce. And an economic framework that completely outlaws the exploitation of surplus value.
It's incredibly comprehensive.
It is, but I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
What if a society just ignores it?
Ignore the blueprint.
Yeah. What if a society decides, you know what, we actually like our corrupt bureaucracy, we like our massive gender wage gap, and we really like our billionaire feudal lords?
Right, what's stopping them?
Exactly. How does the system enforce itself? Does God strike the corrupt society down with lightning?
Well, this brings us to the social physics of this whole blueprint. The Law of Requital.
The Law of Requital. The Arabic term is makafat iyam.
Okay.
This is where the engineering blueprint metaphor we started with really solidifies into hard science. The universe operates on strict, immutable laws of cause and effect.
So it's not arbitrary.
No, it's not about an angry, emotional deity punishing people in a fit of rage because they didn't follow the rules. It's a scientific, unavoidable consequence of social conduct.
I always think of it like gravity.
Gravity.
Yeah, gravity isn't angry at you when you step off the roof of a building. Gravity doesn't have a vendetta against you. You just violated the physical law of your environment, and the sudden stop at the bottom is the natural consequence.
That is exactly how makafat iyam works. The Law of Requital applies that exact same physics to sociology and economics.
Wow.
A society's survival is intrinsically tied to its economic justice. Destinies are not altered by chanting words at a shrine.
Right.
If a society acts on rational conviction and ensures equitable wealth distribution, it thrives and becomes robust.
But if they ignore it?
If a society ignores the divine laws of justice and merely expects miracles, if it relies on those prayers of disbelief involving extended hands and crying eyes utterly divorced from physical labor, their efforts will yield absolutely nothing in the physical world.
They just collapse.
They will collapse under the weight of their own inequality.
The source text actually quotes the philosopher Muhammad Iqbal here, who summarized this perfectly. He said, "Destiny cannot be altered by your prayers, but it is possible that your prayer alters you."
That quote is profoundly heavy.
It really is. Your prayer alters you, meaning the strategic vision, the arzu, changes your internal psychology. It mobilizes you to do the grueling physical work that eventually alters your destiny.
But I struggle with how this applies to the most famous figures in religious history.
The prophets.
Yeah. The prophets are universally framed as the ultimate receivers of miracles. They're the ones who supposedly just prayed, and the laws of physics bent for them.
Right. That's the standard story.
So how does Parwez reconcile the prophets with this strict, uncompromising law of requital?
By completely reframing their historical narratives away from magic and towards systemic activism.
Systemic activism.
Yes. The source provides two profound examples. First, look at Prophet Noah.
Okay, Noah and the flood.
Right. When Noah was facing the absolute corruption of his society and an impending catastrophic flood, which represents a total systemic collapse, he called out to God. He made dua.
And what was the Ijaba? God's answer.
Well, did God magically evaporate the floodwaters or teleport Noah to safety?
No, obviously not.
No. The acceptance of his prayer manifested as a practical physical mandate: build an ark.
Wow, so it's like,
Right.
I'm not stopping the water. Here are the engineering blueprints for a boat.
Exactly. Cut down the trees, mill the lumber, and get to work. It's an instruction for physical labor.
And the second example is even more political. Moses and Aaron facing the tyranny of Pharaoh.
Because Pharaoh represents the ultimate oppressive monarchical despotism.
He is the pinnacle of the corrupt system. So Moses calls out, making dua to dismantle this horrific tyranny.
And God's response.
It wasn't a magic spell to make Pharaoh disappear into thin air. God commanded them to stand firm. The term is istiqamat.
Istiqamat.
Yes. They were given a rigorous program of organized resistance. They had to build a counter-movement within the belly of the empire.
Which means that divine laws require kinetic enforcement by human beings. You cannot just wish a tyrant away from a comfortable distance.
You have to physically outmaneuver and outwork the tyrannical system.
And the text you're studying does not shy away from how brutal that friction can be. There's a specific sequence of Arabic terms in verse 195 that outlines the stages of this revolutionary struggle.
Yes, the 4 stages.
Hajaru, Ukriju, Uzu, Wakatalu. Let me tell you, when I was reviewing my notes, the escalating intensity of these words really struck me.
The escalation is deliberate, and it's highly realistic. Traditionally, people either view these words as distant historical events that happened to ancient tribes.
Right, like old stories.
Or worse, they internalize them as justifications for ascetic passive suffering. The idea that, well, I must suffer quietly under an abusive boss or a corrupt government because God loves those who suffer patiently.
Which is another way to pacify people.
Exactly. Parwez argues that systemically, these words represent the continuous, highly active, and deeply uncomfortable revolutionary struggle required to establish the divine order against entrenched elites.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of this revolution. The first stage is Hajaru.
Hajaru is the root word for hijrat. The mechanism here is the deliberate abandonment of your comfort zone for the sake of an ideology.
So unplugging from the system.
Exactly. It means psychologically and physically leaving a corrupt system, even if that system currently benefits you. It could mean leaving your home, your wealth, or your social status to form a new, just community.
It is the initial, definitive rejection of the exploitative status quo.
You unplug from the matrix, essentially. But the system doesn't just let you leave quietly.
They never do.
Which leads to the next 2 stages, Ukriju and Uzu.
Right, because when you challenge a corrupt economic engine by forming a counter-system, the elites running that engine will inevitably fight back.
Ukriju means being systematically expelled or boycotted.
And Uzu means enduring intense, targeted, systemic persecution.
You will face material hardship. You will be slandered. The state apparatus might be weaponized against you.
The elites will try to starve your movement of resources.
And if you survive the boycotts and the persecution, the friction reaches its absolute peak. The final term is Qatalu.
Qitl. The mechanism of Qitl is engaging in direct, unavoidable ideological or physical conflict against oppressive structures.
It means actively fighting the system to dismantle it.
The source is unambiguous here. Passive wishes do not transform societies.
No, they don't. Establishing a perfectly balanced economy that Hussein Thawabi discussed requires the organized caravan, the Milat, to endure intense, kinetic systemic friction to violently uproot tyrannical structures.
Because you cannot gently ask a billionaire monopolist or a feudal lord to voluntarily give up their stranglehold on resources.
They will not dismantle their own empires out of the goodness of their hearts.
You have to endure the friction of replacing their system. It requires unyielding perseverance and the absolute willingness to sacrifice material comfort for ideological truth.
And the endurance of that friction is the true test of Iman, of rational conviction.
Right.
If your faith collapses at the first sign of Uzu, the moment you face persecution or lose your job for speaking out against corruption, that it wasn't intellectual conviction at all.
It was just a fragile, emotional high.
Exactly. Easily broken by the physical reality of the Law of Requital.
This has been a deeply challenging analysis.
It really reorients everything.
We started with this image of a civilizational blueprint gathering dust on a wall, being treated like a magical relic. And by breaking down just a handful of terms from Surah Al-Imran, we've completely wiped away the dust to reveal the engineering underneath.
The real functional mechanics.
Yes. We've moved from this passive, humiliating wish-making at shrines, begging courtiers in a spiritual monarchy for crumbs, to understanding this text as a rigorous, ironclad constitution.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the ultimate permanent value established here is absolute socioeconomic justice and equilibrium.
It demands unshakable intellectual conviction.
It demands absolute gender parity in the workforce.
It demands strenuous socio-political action against tyranny.
And it guarantees the exact, perfect economic return for that labor, enforced by the unbending physical law of requital.
It's a system designed to eradicate both capitalism and feudalism, ensuring no one's labor is ever exploited.
It's a massive, sweeping vision.
It is. But here is where the blueprint leaves us with a massive structural problem and, honestly, a bit of a paradox.
Oh, what's the paradox?
Well, we've established that your physical labor and the pursuit of socioeconomic justice are the true prayers that build a civilization.
Right.
And we've established that the central authority, the markaz, must ensure no worker's labor is wasted and that everyone receives husn athawab.
The mechanics of the state guarantee the return of labor.
Yes. But if everyone in the Malat is working constructively and the economic engine is running efficiently and everyone is guaranteed the fruits of their labor without exploitation, society will inevitably generate massive amounts of surplus wealth.
Yes, it would.
So how does this markaz, this central authority, manage and distribute that massive surplus wealth without inevitably turning into a bloated bureaucracy itself? How do you empower a central state to enforce absolute justice without creating a new class of elites that eventually become the very gatekeepers we just fought to abolish?
The management of surplus wealth without slipping into totalitarianism is the ultimate friction point of any state apparatus.
Exactly.
How do you manage the system of providence without becoming a tyrant yourself? It is the razor's edge of statecraft.
And that exact friction point, that precise engineering challenge, is where the next lecture in Allama Parwez's series picks up. We'll have to dive into the mechanism of surplus wealth in the blueprint next time.
It's a vital structural question to end on. But before we conclude, I want to leave the listener with a final thought to mull over.
Go ahead.
We talked about how Iqbal noted that destiny cannot be altered by your prayers, but your prayer alters you. It changes your psychology to take action.
Right.
So look at your own life. Look at the structures, the bureaucracies, and the economic systems around you. What systemic anomaly, what injustice or friction in your own life or community are you currently trying to, quote-unquote, pray away with passive wishes instead of actively working to dismantle?
Are you just staring at the blueprint, waiting for the house to build itself? Or are you ready to pick up a hammer? Think about it.